Okay, we're live.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Wikimedia Research Showcase for November 2022. My name is Pablo Aragon. I'm a research scientist at the Wikimedia Foundation, and I have the pleasure to host today's session. The theme of this session, this showcase, is around Wikipedia and academic libraries. In the research team, the Wikimedia Foundation, we are interested that the showcases not only serve to present recent research works, but also become opportunities to connect the Wikimedia research community with other communities of the Wikimedia movement. And GLAM, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, is a fundamental community as they provide the bedrock for our verifiable information. As claimed in the Wikimedia Libraries International Convention, the WikiLiveCon, held this summer, librarians are engaged with Wikimedia projects by leading new programs, launching interactive maps, editing Wikipedia articles, transcribing texts, creating citations, teaching students, connecting with newcomers, and preserving and promoting languages and culture. So we ask today, how can research serve librarians and vice versa? So, and also what are the challenges of librarians that can be addressed through research? So to approximate these challenges, I'm very excited about today's speakers. First, we have Laurie Bridges and Michael David Miller. Laurie is an instruction and outreach librarian and professor at Oregon State University Libraries. And she will introduce the open access edited book, Wikipedia and Academic Libraries, a global project that she co-edited with 20 chapters from over 50 authors. Michael David is an associate librarian with tenure at McGill University, and his talk will focus on Liaison librarian contributions to local Quebecois LGBTQ+ content in Francophone Wikipedia. In the second half, we have Nerissa Lindsey, Head of Content Organization and Management at San Diego State University, also librarian, and she will be presenting her work on ethical considerations of including gender information in open knowledge platforms, in particular Wikidata. So I want to thank the speakers for joining us today to share their research. At the end of each talk, we'll have time for Q&A. If you have questions for the speakers, please put them in the chat on IRC or in the chat on YouTube, and my colleague Miriam Reddy will monitor and relay them here. And with this, I will stop talking and pass it on to Laurie.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and start the slideshow. So as we were introduced, my name is Laurie Bridges, and with me today is Michael David Miller. And I was a co-editor of this open access volume, Wikipedia and Academic Libraries, a global project. And for the first few minutes, I'm just going to go over a brief introduction and then process for creating the volume. And Michael will talk next about the chapter that he co-authored. So the reason I want to talk about editing a book is because a lot of folks have not done it. And before I edited a volume, I had a lot of questions about how it was done and the process. So with that in mind, I want to share the process for creating an open access edited volume. The first step for me was beginning with an idea. So I had just began my work with the Wikimedia movement, and I was working specifically with Wikipedia, and I was wanting to see what other librarians in the academic sphere had done. And there were a few articles out there, but mostly they were overviews of why it would be important to work with Wikipedia. And what I was really wanting was case studies, which is something that US and Canadian librarians write about a lot, or just case studies of what we've done and what worked well. And so I knew that there would be interest in publishing such a volume within librarianship. And I hoped that people would be interested in submitting chapter ideas. So with that, I put together an editing team, and I work very well personally in teams of 3. So I asked 2 of my colleagues, Ray Pun, who is a well-known librarian in the US, and Ray has edited numerous volumes, but Ray had never edited an open access volume before. And then Roberto Arteaga, who is a librarian just north of me in Washington State. And Roberto is just beginning his journey with Wikipedia. And so he had actually been asking me some questions. And so I asked him if he would be interested in joining the team. So it was 3 of us, and we kind of wrote a plan of what we wanted. And then we started looking at different publishers. And this is where things started getting complicated, because we did want open access. And this meant we were limited to some publishers, and that we would probably have to come up with the funding ourselves to publish the book. There are more presses now that offer the open access option up front, but at the time, that was not the case. So the first group we went to was Lever Press, which is a new publisher in the US, and it's a consortium of libraries who basically all chip in a little bit of money to run this press. It does have a new editor as of this year. A new lead editor. But at the time we submitted it, we were waiting, and we were hopeful, because if you get your idea accepted by Lever Press, then they pay for everything and you don't have to worry about those pieces. Sadly, it was not accepted by Lever Press after a few months. So then we moved on to Ubiquity and Maze Books. And Ubiquity's we wanted Ubiquity. We really liked their offerings, but the full cost was $10,000. And so Maze Books is a sidearm of Michigan Publishing, and Michigan Publishing is well known in the US. And so we went with Maze, and that total cost was $5,000. Now, where the tricky part came in was, do you want a publisher first or the chapter authors first when you have an open access volume and you're trying to get funding? So we were always playing somewhat of a dance trying to decide which order to go in. So we did get the publisher. We did not have $5,000 up front, and we didn't have the chapter authors. So we were doing all of this kind of simultaneously. The next step was to identify the book chapters, and because of the cost estimate, we had an estimate for a 20 chapter volume. And so we knew we only could accept 20 chapters. We hoped we would get 20 proposals, but we got 60 proposals, which was a very big surprise to all of us that we had so many. So we were excited about that. And at this stage, the editors are deciding how they want to craft their book and what they want to include in the book. So in this stage, Roberto, Ray, and I had many conversations about what direction we were going and what we wanted the book to achieve. And one of those things was that we wanted broad international representation, and over 30 of the proposals were from the United States. So there were many chapters within the US that were not accepted, simply because we were trying to build excitement and capacity within the international librarianship field. And then we had to select the 20, after we selected the 20 chapters, we had to make sure everyone was okay with publishing in open access. So we had several conversations about that. In the end, we identified funding from 3 sources. One was a Creative Commons community activities grant for $1,000. One was a Wikimedia Foundation Rapid grant for $2,000. At the time, the Rapid grants only went up to $2,000. I will tell you that now they go up to $5,000. So it would be easier today because we could potentially just get it with one grant, fund the whole thing. And then my own library has a faculty development grant, and we were awarded $2,000 from that. The process for peer review is a little bit unique. As I said, Ray Pun had edited books before, and he wanted to do a sequential peer review, which I really enjoyed. I had never participated in a sequential peer review process before. And that is where you take the chapter and you give it to the first peer reviewer, that reviewer edits it. Then we made sure to remove the name of the editor, and then you send it on to the second, I mean, not editor, peer reviewer. Then you send it on to the second peer reviewer, and they can see the first peer reviewer's comments. And throughout the process, the editors and I had split the chapters into 3 so that we each had a similar amount of chapters to oversee. And we made sure that the chapter authors did not know who their peer reviewers were, although we allowed the peer reviewers to see who the authors were, simply because when doing Wikipedia work, you name so many activities and you have names for your edit-a-thons, so it's really almost impossible to keep that private. During the process, we learned that between us 3 editors, I was reading all the chapters meticulously before I gave them to peer reviewers, but then others were just sending them directly to the peer reviewers, and we kind of adjusted the process and decided in the future we would read them before sending them to the peer reviewers to answer any questions that we had. And then finally, another lesson we learned was I wasn't particularly happy with the book cover, and we would have started on that earlier and been able to tell that we weren't happy and gone our own direction. Also, getting it into library catalogs was oddly difficult. We weren't expecting that. And then finally, just wrapping up the book, we had many pieces. One is copy editing. So that was part of the payment to Maze Books, was their copy editing services. We had the option to pay for indexing or not have an index. We decided to pay for indexing. Then publishing it. The book is online, free OA, but it can be printed on demand and sent anywhere in the world. And then finally was promotion. The Maze Books really didn't do that much promotion, so that was a surprise also to us. So we would also ask about marketing afterward. But the entire process was 2 years. And so now I'd like to hand it off to Michael, who is one of the chapter authors, to discuss his chapter.
Thank you, Laurie. And thank you also for convincing me to submit a book chapter proposal. Laurie and I met on Twitter a couple years ago, and she's been a person that I've admired for a long time. And I'm really happy that that she and her co-editors decided to publish to edit this book. So my name is Michael David Miller. I'm an associate librarian at McGill University, where I'm the Liaison Librarian for French Literature, Economics, and Gender Studies. And for those of you who aren't too familiar with Quebec, that's where McGill University is found. We're a part of Canada. Quebec's the French-speaking part of Canada. And we've spoken French in Quebec for about 400 years now. And I just like to remind people that there's a third language, in addition to all the indigenous languages that's spoken in North America. We have a little small part of like La Francophonie in North America. So in addition to being at McGill, I'm also the vice president of Wikimedia Canada, and I'm on the board of Wikifranca, which is kind of like it's an international association of Wikimedia's chapters, user groups, and thematic groups across the world that work with the Francophone Wikimedia projects. Which, for those of you who weren't with us earlier, I'm in Paris in the moment for the Francophone Wiki Convention that's going to start on Saturday. So can we move to the next slide? Thank you, Laurie. So this quote by Kelly Doyle is one of the most influential passages I think I've ever read while reading about Wikipedia and professional literature. And I just want to read it out loud to you so that we can all have a moment to think about this. The cultural capital of Wikipedia is such that existence within it denotes a level of power and importance. The phenomenon of considering something or someone truly significant or insignificant through its presence or absence on Wikipedia can be a damaging one. So this citation really resonated with me and started an ongoing reflection on the power of existing and not existing in Wikipedia. So it's from the book called Leveraging Wikipedia that was edited by Marilee Prophet. She works at OCLC in the research division. And the citation's from Kelly Doyle's chapter, Minding the Gaps, Engaging Academic Librarians to Address Content and User Imbalances on Wikipedia. So the citation got me thinking about what it means to be a queer person in a French-speaking area in North America, and just asking myself, do my people, does my culture exist on on Wikipedia. And I had started to dig in the Francophone Wikipedia and realized that there was what I perceived to be and what I believed to be a very large queer content gap in the Francophone Wikipedia, particularly with regard to the French-speaking populations community in Quebec and in Canada. Next slide, please. So realizing that there's a potential gap, and I just say potential because I don't actually have any, I mean, the data you'll see later might say that there's a gap, but I feel like there's a lot of factors that I haven't taken into consideration to be able to 100% say that we can truly prove that there's a gap. Anyway, I'm like 99% sure that there's a content gap. I decided to organize a series of workshops inspired from some workshops that I'd attended in 2017 when I started getting involved in the Wikimedia movement that were held at the Cinémathèque Québécoise, or the National Film Library of Quebec. During these activities that I held at the LGBTQ+ Community Center in their library space in Montreal, we would invite an important figure from the LGBTQ+ community. And this person would hold a 45 to 60-minute conference-like presentation where they would talk about their career, why they do what they do, why they love what they do, or maybe why they dislike what they do. I mean, I suppose they could talk about both. And they would share their perspectives on the importance of the visibility of the Quebecois queer community on the internet, and particularly in French. For example, these activities were about queer Quebecois history, important current queer figures like Barbada de Barbade, Rita Baga, which are more and more internationally known Montreal drag queens. For those of you who follow Drag Race, know that there's a Belgian version coming out, and Rita Baga is going to be the host of Drag Race Belgium. And for those of you that might watch Canadian television programs, there's a show called Call Me Mother that Barbada de Barbade is a judge on. We'd also work with local queer authors. We'd invite them and they would give presentations, such as queer authors like Kevin Lambert and Antoine Charbonneau de Mers. And we also worked on queer events to make sure that local Pride events also existed within Wikipedia, like the Pride event that's held in the city of Sherbrooke in the southern part of Quebec. Next slide, please. So I'd like to share some data with you. And this data is updated from the data that you see in my book chapter. So this data here was updated in April 2022. And the first column, we have the categories. So you have the main category, LGBT par pays, or by country, and beneath that you have subcategories for the LGBT in France, Congo, Kinshasa, that's the Democratic Republic of Congo, Algeria, Morocco, Cameroon, Belgium, Côte d'Ivoire, Quebec, Tunisia, Switzerland, Canada. There's an asterisk there because this is Canada excluding Quebec, and then the United States and the UK. And you'll understand the United States and the UK in a moment. And then in the next column, we have the number of articles that are associated with those categories. And we see that in certain Francophone regions in the world, there just aren't any articles and the category doesn't exist. And that's the case for the Congo Kinshasa. And then we see the number, the percentage of those articles with regard to the 5,353 articles that are in the entire umbrella category LGBT par pays. And then at the very right, because I believe we're making this presentation available to you, you can click on those links and they'll take you to those number of articles. Because what's really great is there's this tool called PetScan, and you can look at the number of articles that are in a category as well as in the subcategories of those articles. And as you can tell, we're numerous librarians on this presentation, so the classifications of things are very important to us. So as you can see in this data, there's an surprisingly an overrepresentation, or I mean, I guess overrepresentation might not be the best word in this case, but there's a very large percentage of the 5,000 articles that are about either the United States or the United Kingdom. Well, I just put them together because for me, they form like one of the cores of the Anglo-American world. So they're nearly half of all the articles that are in the Francophone Wikipedia that talk about queer things in Wikipedia are about the United States or the United Kingdom. And I mean, I have some theories as to why this might be the case. Francophones in France tend to be extremely Anglophile. They like the US and the UK. And there's a lot of important queer events that happened in the United States that have, I think, helped influence just how the queer world is viewed across the planet. So when you think of Stonewall, and then there's important UK figures like Ella Turney. Next slide, please. In this table, we see the evolution of the number of articles in the LGBT au Québec category. And then, so we see that there's a steady increase, and I don't have a slide for this, but the actual, we're dealing with kind of like a double gap problem in the Francophone Wikipedia. The first one is that Quebec is already underrepresented within the Francophone Wikipedia, and then a lot of our like underrepresented communities in Quebec are also underrepresented in the Francophone community. So there's like a double layer of trying to increase content in the Francophone Wikipedia that we're dealing with. But what's nice that I've noticed is that we've seen a gradual increase, and I believe this is about 20% increase from 2016 to 2022. And if we look at the overall number of articles that are about Quebec in the Francophone Wikipedia, we see a relative like similar percentage increase of about 20%. And I believe these increases are due to two main reasons, particularly in the queer context. The first is I hold a relatively, I wouldn't say like a large number, but I do hold quite a few like queer contribution events in Quebec for Wikipedia. With the LGBTQ plus community center. And I also like personally participate in trying to increase these articles. So if I see like a queer person that's in the media or an event or just something like I notice that there's public interest in, the media is talking about it, I know that there's sources, so I'll try to write about it. Can we move to the next slide? The second reason that there's been an increase in these articles is a very librarian reason, and it has to do with the categories we were talking about earlier. So what I did is I went and there's this book called Modèle Recherché, and it talks about homosexuality and bisexuality and coming out stories of important people in Quebec. So artists, musicians, politicians, etc. And I started to go through this book to see, and I would look on Wikipedia to see if these people had articles on Wikipedia. And if they did, was there a category, the LGBT au Québec category associated with their article? And in a lot of the cases, it wasn't. So I started to add the association. So we saw a gradual increase in the number of articles because we were adding that classification to those articles. Then I thought, if those people that I found in this book they don't have the proper categorization in Wikipedia, maybe there's a lot of other articles that talk about Quebec's queer history that don't have this category in Wikipedia. So I started doing spot searching, and I would search for things like Quebec and queer and gay and homosexual and trans, and then I would add the categories to those articles, which I think is a really interesting way for librarians to go above and beyond our traditional one lib, one ref campaign every year, is that we can classify Wikipedia. I mean, granted, the great thing about a Wikipedia article is it can have a lot of categories attached to it, and we're just adding an additional category that may contribute to the discoverability of these different Wikipedia articles. So I think, it's very librarian to add controlled vocabularies to things, and Wikipedia is a thing that we can add controlled vocabularies to. Next slide, please. Which this kind of brings me to like my philosophy and the things that I think, like how Wikipedia naturally intersects with my work and how it kind of can evolve my work from a more of a passive role to more of an active role in knowledge production. So the first thing is like, I mean, I say this and some of my colleagues kind of laugh at me, but I think like Wikipedia is a way that we can take our collections from being very passive and we can make them active collections. And, since a lot of us have a lot of like electronic collections now, we can dust off like the electronic dust from our collections. So we have so many things in our libraries that can contribute to making Wikipedia better. And I'm speaking to the choir, everybody's convinced that library collections are important for making Wikipedia better. Also, like we tend to have what I believe to be a more passive role in like information literacy and teaching students and about searching and citation, etc. But with Wikipedia, and if you go back and look at Laurie's 2 editorials in the Journal of Academic Librarianship, we can make these more active and actually have students do things that contribute to a greater information good. And also, like libraries are trying to become more anchored in their local communities, not only public libraries, but university libraries and academic libraries. So it gives us an opportunity to try to contribute to the the underrepresentation of certain communities within Wikipedia, like the queer community, the BIPOC community, women. I mean, a lot of communities are underrepresented in Wikipedia. And then this also helps create new relationships. So thanks to these activities I've done with the the LGBTQ plus community center in Montreal, and then you'll see later that I'm going to start working with the Gay Archives of Quebec. It allows my library to have a link with these community libraries and potentially have access to these communities that we didn't before. Which makes me think about this really, I mean, I really like David Lankey, so I need to be transparent with that. But he has some really great quotes in his publications. So for example, this one, the mission of libraries is to improve society through facilitating knowledge creation in their communities, or put more simply, librarians and the libraries they build make the world better by helping people learn. So by working with Wikipedia, I feel like I'm helping my local community create knowledge in their communities. Granted, I mean, it's the synthesis of knowledge that already exists, but it's making people more visible. Next slide, please. And I'm almost done, I promise. I'd like to come back to this quote by Kelly Doyle and ask ourselves a follow-up question, or more of like a question to think on. If a community does not exist on Wikipedia or the web, do they truly exist in 2023? If we cannot find information about our community, how can we learn about them? And so particularly for somebody who's a part of a community, and I think a lot about like young queer people that want to learn about the queer community around them, particularly in French in Quebec, if there's nothing written about those queer communities in Wikipedia in French, it's possible that those young people might think that those communities don't actually exist, or they're not important enough to exist if they don't exist on Wikipedia. And given that there's so much Anglo-American content in the Francophone Wikipedia about the queer community, they might think that the only way that they can live their queerness is to do it in English in the United States or in the UK or in English Canada. So ultimately, my desire is to exist. I want my community to exist on Wikipedia. And it's one of the main driving motivators that pushes me to contribute to Wikipedia. And then we can go to our last slide. And I've been able to restart some queer contributions with the Quebec Gay Archives. I hope that this work will continue. And maybe there will be a part 2 to this chapter in a future edited book that Laurie might do. That's an idea, Laurie. You could do a follow-up to your book. So if you have any questions, Laurie and I would be happy to take them.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you, for your presentations. First, I don't know if anyone in the room has questions for either Michael, David, or Laurie. I do.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. I was I'm mute and then I mute again. Thank you so much for this work from YouTube. You are getting lots of love for the book, and there are a few authors as well. So thank you. This is a very, very exciting initiative, and thank you for moving this forward. I have a question for Michael. That is, in the research team and other researchers in different spaces in all around computer science or computational social science are working on producing data around the state of knowledge gaps, for example. So there are ways in which we can measure, for example, distribution of articles across different genders or different geographies. My question would be, how can this initiative or any other initiative or any other type of data analysis or data generation could be helpful for the work that you do, which is amazing. I'm just trying to say, because there are many researchers from computational sciences that are hearing us. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestion about how they could help the work that you do.
I think like the challenge is like, what am I benchmarking this against? So I think there's a content gap because there's so much more Anglo-American content, but in general, like maybe we've been relatively exhaustive in the coverage of Quebec queer culture on Wikipedia, or the things that we're allowed to write about, given that there are the challenges with secondary sources just not being available on minority communities. So that's why I mean, I truly believe there is a content gap, but I know that data, like I don't have like, I mean, maybe my data is firm, I don't know. I feel like I don't have like clear 100% data where I can be like, we know there's a content gap. Like we do know that there's a content gap with the biographies on men and women. I think that one's one that I assume there's a gap with the queer community, but there's nothing for me to benchmark it against. I mean, naturally, the majority communities will have more articles. Naturally, like the majority culture will have more articles. So I guess it's more like, I just don't, I actually, I don't know. I'm going to continue to do this work in the hopes that every time there's something new, maybe I can document it and make it available on Wikipedia. But I think actually the bigger challenge isn't identifying the gaps, but it's more having the secondary sources to be able to write about the people or the events, or also the fact that maybe some secondary sources aren't considered notable enough in some of the different language Wikipedias. So maybe the local queer magazine is not considered to be an authoritative source. Granted, it's the only place that this type of stuff is talked about. I don't think that really answers your question, Miriam. I apologize.
Yes, and the problem of the reference, or what we will call the denominator. So we know, for example, the percentage of article about, I don't know, Italy on English Wikipedia, but deciding what is the right amount, that is
right.
Something that that is an open question. And in most of the work that we do on measuring knowledge gaps, we provide essentially the tools to say, this is the distribution of articles across the categories that you need. And then it's a tool for the communities to say, these are the numbers. And it's up to each community to say how they want to change those numbers. Because it's getting enough context at the research level is a little bit difficult. So 100% I understand your point.
Thank you.
Any other question?
Oh, can I go? Should I?
Yes, better
Okay.
now.
Okay, thank you, Paolo. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I'm Diego. I'm also from the research team in the Wikimedia Foundation. And I have questions about some of the LGBT content that you have showing. That's very interesting. We are doing currently some research in the space of knowledge integrity. That is the other big line of research that we have in the research team, especially on Wikidata. And we have noticed that in Wikidata, some of the controversies are related to gender. So there's certain kind of vandalism on changing people's gender for probably different reasons. And admins are like very aware of these things. They use a lot of different tools like abuse filters to understand when someone's gender is changed. And sometimes there's certain kind of discussions, and sometimes there's even edit words around it. So I don't know if you have done any kind of qualitative study on such kind of content, especially related to biographies, and if you have noticed any kind of either problem, biases, hate speech there that it's related with such biographies. It's a very general question, but it's exactly what I'm researching about now. So if you have any like insight about that, or even your impressions on how community deals and how vandalism is related to this content, and even especially hate speech is related with this content, it would be very interesting for me to know about that.
I don't think I can necessarily really talk about the hate speech aspect, because I think because Quebec is such a small community within the French-speaking world, I think a lot of our stuff goes unnoticed. So I mean, there's an advantage and disadvantage to being so small. But I do know that there are like controversies around misgendering, which some people would disagree with me that it's misgendering, but the idea of misgendering people that trans people, for example, and non-binary people, that in their everyday lives, they will use certain pronouns, but in the French Wikipedia, we will stick with the pronouns that were assigned to them at birth. And unless they've had like a complete legal change, even at that, I don't know if that's considered, because there's also a rule in the French Wikipedia, like the rule of the least confusion. So there's a lot of discussion and a lot of groups in the French Wikipedia that are trying to make it more open to inclusive language, open to properly gendering people. I'd have to look, but I wouldn't be surprised if like the article on like the only person that's coming to mind right now for me is Caitlyn Jenner, which I know is maybe not the best example to use, but it wouldn't shock me to see that maybe in the French Wikipedia we still would refer to Caitlyn Jenner as he, though I could be completely wrong. But I know there's a big debate coming up on whether or not we should use masculine and feminine categories in the French Wikipedia, because it's not systematic. We do use some of them. I know that in the Catalan Wikipedia, they refuse to use feminine categories. So everything is referred to as masculine, which I think can make it even more difficult to try to figure out if there are any like gender gaps. And I feel like maybe a lot of the hate speech actually is happening, not necessarily on the Wikipedia articles themselves, but more in the discussion pages. And I think people are really good at making they nuance what they say, but you can often read between the lines and you can tell that it could be considered possibly hate speech. Yeah, again, I didn't really answer your question all that well. I apologize. Diego.
Thank you. I have another question. Like, I find the quote that you brought from Kelly Doyle very interesting because it focuses on both the relevance but also the unexpected consequences of the notability policy in Wikipedia. So some months ago, Francesca Tripodi was here in the showcase presenting her research on gender, an article for Delation Dynamics, where she concluded that there is a gender bias in who gets to be notable and who doesn't. And I'm curious if this is the case for LGBTQ plus rated biographies. And these questions goes to you, Mike, but also for Laurie. We know that she's also interested in studying conversations and talk pages in LGBTQ plus articles. So I'm wondering if this space of content is also affected by the notability dynamics.
I think there is a notability problem with LGBTQ content, simply because I think it tends to, I feel like, because if I look back at a lot of things I contributed to, the living people that I've written about, they were all assigned male at birth. And the more I like look back at the work that I've done, I'm like, oh, this is because these are the people that have been written about in the media. Like there's a few prominent queer women, and I actually think most of them already have articles, but I think a lot of like the same gender problems are reproduced within the minority communities. And I think we would probably, if we looked at like the Black community or the Hispanic community in a North American context, that there would be a larger representation of men than women. And yeah, Laurie, do you want to add anything?
I do get alerts. I have set up, as a good librarian would, I have set up a lot of alerts, so I get daily updates about research, and I haven't seen any articles that are doing the deep dive on deletion that has been done on gender. So, I mean, I would assume it's similar, but I haven't seen any studies showing that.
Okay, so
but I think the notability problem is, sorry, Pablo, the notability problem is because a lot of rules that the person has to be known nationally, they have to have been in very important publications, and a lot of like queer and minority groups don't end up making it into these important secondary publications. And I think that that definitely is a challenge, because the only people that I can confidently write about right now are I mean, they're either drag queens or important historical events that have maybe led to like legislation changes in Quebec. Smaller queer artists that may only be known in like very select and fringe circles, but that are still very much important to that community. I mean, I don't even dare write about them yet, because I don't want to write about them, then have it deleted, and then maybe they become well-known one day, and then like it be flagged because it was deleted in the past. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both for your answers. So if there are no more questions, thank you again for your talk. And now it's time for Nerissa.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen really quick here. Everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to double check. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're hailing from or tuning in from. As Paula mentioned, my name is Nerissa Lindsey, and I am the head of content organization and management here at San Diego State University. And today I'm going to talk about a research paper that I published with my research colleagues in the Kula Journal, which is the Knowledge Creation, Dissemination, Preservation Studies special issue on metadata as knowledge. And the topic was ethical considerations of including gender information in open knowledge platforms. I just want to quickly mention that I'm not the sole author of this research paper. I worked with a research team that consisted of my colleague, Kurt Hanselman, who's the catalog librarian here with me at San Diego State University, and my colleague, Greta Suter, who is currently the manuscript archivist at Ohio State University. I'm just speaking on behalf of our whole group. So I want to start by giving a little background about why we decided to do some research on the use of gender in open knowledge platforms. We didn't immediately seek to just research the use of gender, but we ended up writing about that property in particular. It started with the three of us kind of separately participating in the PCC Wikidata Pilot, which was a pilot that started in the fall of 2020. It's predominantly academic libraries getting together to start talking about not just through how to add information to Wikidata, but also why we might want to add that information and what we could do with it. In general, some of the conversations we had via the listservs and other forums generated this kind of collision of ethics, values, and community norms from the library community and the Wikidata community. And it got many of us in the library world just thinking in general about the ethics of including personal demographic information such as ethnicity, gender, etc., into these large publicly available open knowledge projects. So that got Kurt and Greta and myself kind of wondering, for the people who were participating in these open knowledge platforms, if they had specific policies or guidance that's available, or any type of policy in place about what personal demographic information they would include and why. The other thing that kind of motivated us is we had this idea that gender is complex. I'm sure many of you might have seen this gender unicorn teaching graphic, but gender is informed by multiple data points. This graphic shows that 5 different points altogether can define a person's gender. These are gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, who someone's physically attracted to, and who someone's emotionally attracted to. And each of these points have 3 different options, and the options are not fixed in time or amount. And these data points can essentially be fluid over a person's lifetime, and as such are very hard to pinpoint in just a few options within a library catalog or a dropdown in Wikipedia, or Wikidata, my apologies. And we knew that in Wikidata, there are items for people, places, concepts, and things. and each item is by properties. And for people, there's over 150 different personal properties that can be used. Some of these properties are designated as properties that may violate privacy. And the guidance for these properties states that when this property is used with items for living people, it may violate privacy. And these statements should generally not be supplied unless they can be considered widespread public knowledge or openly supplied by the individual themselves. But P21, the property for sex or gender, is not tagged as a property that may violate privacy. In Wikidata, the definition of the property is recommended for describing humans as male, female, non-binary, intersex, transgender female, transgender male, and agender. But it's also used, it's kind of conflated with gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex, which, you know, given the graphic, it's kind of understood that all of these different properties could be different, have different answers, but Wikidata is kind of conflating the two. Additionally, the sex or gender property in Wikidata has its open history available online, and early discussions around the property indicated that you brought out that sort of point that the two things were being conflated, biological sex and gender identity. And conversations also considered that some languages don't have a concept of maleness separate as a thing separate from humanness. So it seems that the property is a compromise for the global community. Even though the property isn't perfect, it's still widely adopted by the Wikidata community and is seen as one of the essential properties in describing people. And I do want to point out that in this screenshot, the Wikidata dropdown does allow for some examples of third gender identities from Samoan, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander cultures. So we kind of knew that there was this sort of backdrop of kind of issues, particularly with gender Wikidata, that we were starting to think about as we started to participate in this pilot. We also were kind of thinking with this backdrop of, like, you know, are there inherent risks, particularly in the United States? We are far from a post-gender utopia. There's a lot of possible and real harm being inflicted on people's rights in legislature, where we have laws against abortions, increasing laws against gender-affirming care, and which is alarming and saddening. And many trans people in particular have experienced hate and death threats. And we have examples of the people working at the Merriam-Webster dictionary receiving death threats just for including gender identity in their definitions of women, female, and girl. And additionally, we've seen attacks on public libraries about what books they can have about LGBTQ plus themes and characters. So we decided to launch a survey querying people who are participating in open knowledge projects to kind of see what they were, what data elements they were including that was personal identifiable information or personal demographic information. And I'm now going to kind of highlight some of the findings we got in from our survey. The survey was launched in the May of 2021, which is about several months after the PCC Wikidata Pilot started. We were hoping to capture people from a global audience from the galleries, archives, libraries, and museum space. And we wanted to keep it open to all open knowledge projects and not just Wikidata or Wikipedia, because we know that there were some other people who might be working in other open knowledge contexts, and we kind of wanted to get a broader picture. We got about 73 responses to our survey that were complete, which isn't a huge amount, but kind of in alignment with how many people were working in the PCC Wikidata Pilot, which I think was our main respondent base. About 77% of the respondents came from the United States, so the data is definitely an American, United States-centric perspective. We did get a mild showing from Canada and a few European countries, but that was generally it. So we didn't get a broader global representative of what people were doing in these spaces. Almost half, 47.95% of the responses came from people working in academic libraries. So most of the data we got were from that audience in particular. And although we asked a question about what percentage of people were working with different personal demographic properties, the largest chunk of the responses, 26.19%, were indicating that they do include the sex or gender property as part of their open knowledge work. We did get a breakdown of what open knowledge platforms the people responding to our survey were using, and almost half, 47%, said that they were using Wikidata, which tracks because I think the survey went out to the PCC Wikidata Pilot, and I think those were the majority of the respondents. But we did get 31% of people saying that they were working in Wikipedia as well. We did get some folks reporting back that they use SNAC or the social networks in archival contexts, and about 10% said that they were using some other open knowledge platform. So this is really what we were trying to get at in our research about people's use of policy and whether or not they are including references for the information that they're adding to these open knowledge platforms. And a big chunk of the respondents for that question said that they either have informal or unwritten policies or no policies at all about including those personal demographic information that they're doing as part of their open knowledge work. 33% indicated that they are not including any references for the personal demographic information they add. So across all categories, race, sexual orientation, they're not including any type of justification for why they're including that information as part of their open knowledge projects. And 9% in particular are not adding references for the sex or gender information that they add. We did have an open-ended question about whether people were using controlled vocabularies for entering this personal demographic information. And we got kind of conflicted responses because I think there was some confusion about whether or not that controlled dropdown in Wikidata constituted a controlled vocabulary. And we did get this very interesting open response that somebody felt particularly constrained by what's in Wikidata, which they describe as imperfect. So they just follow an informal policy of just listing male, female, non-binary, and not trying to say anything like transgender man, because to them that seemed like a hot mess. So they were trying to not use those drop downs, even though they were those options in the drop downs, even though they were available. Our data show that people have very good intentions, as we've heard from other people working in research in this space. We had this open-ended question about what you hope to get out of this personal demographic information that you're entering in your open knowledge projects. And, you know, the theme's really centered around that improving discoverability on demographic properties. And just as we heard earlier, people really want to see if there are gender gaps in Wikipedia articles. They really want to see if there's a gap in the amount of archives from people of color by comparison. And they really want to try to use this data to highlight the inequities within their collections and promote social justice, which are all very noble pursuits. And I would say good possible use of this information. So with that in mind, from this research data that we collected, we kind of came up with some general sort of recommendations for people working in the space, knowing that it's kind of, you know, not, there is not a one solution that will solve all of this. Sorry, I got ahead of the slides here. Our sort of stance from our article is just, if you don't have to include it, not including this information for living persons is probably the safest and most ethical option to ensure that there are no breaches of privacy in publishing private and sensitive information. However, we realize that is a completely unrealistic option and probably not the most helpful suggestion. because we know that there's precedence. This data already exists and is built into the structure of most open knowledge platforms. So we really try to focus on those people who are not developing clear policies and kind of being clear about their intentions. So we want people to be transparent and explicitly document your framing and assumptions when you're going about your projects and including this information. We kind of referenced an article that says transparency should be emphasized in standards creation. The article I mentioned is from Kara Long, Santi Thompson, Sarah Potvin, and Monica Rivero in their 2017 article, The Wicked Problem of Neutral Description Toward a Documentation Approach to Metadata Standards. They're talking about how creators should publish their framing and assumptions alongside their metadata standards to make it clear that if you're going to do an open knowledge project, that you're going to include gender information, that people understand where you're coming from, what your understandings are of what you're entering in that space. And given that there's kind of a lack of guidance for approaching the issue of representing gender in open knowledge bases like Wikidata, we thought that maybe GLAM institutions could choose to lead and set an ethical example of this work. I work in academic libraries, and we're still working in a MARC data-based environment. And we just had the program for Cooperative Cataloging, which is a national cataloging agency, discontinue the use of gender elements and authority data for the Library of Congress authority files. So, we can, use, maybe cross-pollinate with Wikidata practitioners who are coming from outside GLAM institutions, and maybe do some outreach and empower and support Wikidata contributors and help them improve their contributions to open knowledge platforms. And we also recommend that Wikidata users take their time to expand their education on these, especially important that GLAM institutions support greater education around use, best practices to ensure high standards for thoughtful, critical, and ethical metadata contributions. We are of the frame of mind that including sensitive and private personal information could unintentionally out people from minoritized and unrepresented groups, and that could threaten their privacy and potentially livelihoods. So finally, as our survey showed, many in the community are seeking to use open knowledge platforms for the good that can be accomplished with the information, improving discoverability around demographic categories and highlighting inequities. But I think we really want people to avoid harm as much as humanly possible, where possible, and identify where the inclusion of data elements might be harmful, and absolutely trying to speak to those 60% of respondents to develop policy concerning the entering of those data elements. So that is all I have for you. The article link is posted in the Wikimedia research thing, but does anybody have any questions?
Thank you, Nerissa. Thank you very much for your presentation. Again, I don't know if there's anyone in the room with a question. Please, sir.
Oh, sorry. I can. Oh, sorry, Nerissa. Do you want to?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for the interesting talk. So there is some work going on in the team around understanding how we can make some of the recommender systems that we have for editors a little bit more fair. At the moment, when we sample articles to improve, let's say, it's a random sampling from the pool of articles, and so we're kind of replicating the biases and augmenting them. And so this is one aspect where having some gender categories could help, because we could kind of promote or at least reduce this exact bias sampling and maybe kind of balance back. And so you mentioned something around discoverability that you find in your research, and I'm wondering if you can just say a little bit more about that. Like, what are the discoverability needs that people have surfaced? I think this is also interesting for us as we think about research projects, and also how to handle this trade-off between discoverability and privacy.
Yeah, that's a great question. The only question we had in our survey was, what do you hope to accomplish by including this demographic information? So we didn't have too many responses to that, but most of them were very explicitly saying we want to highlight the inequities. And when we first joined the PCC Wikidata Pilot, those were the very conversations people, okay, now we can finally identify where our archive gaps are. We want to use the archives app property to identify, where we're falling short in our collection development policies, right? You can use Wikidata to kind of quantify that, right? So that did come out in that question as, what people were hoping to achieve and accomplish. And people kind of generally said that they were trying to promote social justice, but we asked a follow-up question to this question about if they were trying to use this information for that, if they were tying it to any sort of equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives at their campus. And the majority of the people who answered that question said no. So there was kind of a, a little bit of a disconnect of like, okay, we're trying to promote social justice, but we're not particularly tying it to any particular initiative on campus. So it was kind of this nebulous idea of social justice from the question, if that makes sense. I don't know if I answered the question, but that's really the only data that I have that I can really speak to from what the respondents said.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think there is this sort of interesting and healthy tension here where I think what made a lot of us nervous is that a lot of people were kind of brand new to this space and they were just going all in, just putting whatever data element they could. And I think there's a big difference in developing, like, we're going to actively promote this community who is like kind of wanting to represent themselves, and somebody who is just like may have, sort of information about something that they don't really have any verifiable reference for. I mean, that 9% who's not including references for the information they're adding is very concerning. You should be, even with the inadequacies of what's there, you should at least be able to back up what you've stated to be true, especially in something that's so public and openly. And it gets, anything that's put there, it gets into other systems, and so it kind of matriculates everywhere. And if it's wrong, it can be a bit difficult to kind of dial it all back and be like, oh no, that was wrong. But I don't know.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. If you please finish, please.
No, I just we haven't done any follow-up research yet, but I think it would be really interesting if any follow-up research was done about how people who are represented, like their information is represented, how comfortable they are about having that information. Because I think that would be a very, very interesting piece of the puzzle. Maybe we're creating monsters out of nothing, right? Creating boogeyman out of something that maybe is not, maybe it's overstated, the danger is overstated, but that would be an interesting follow-up and something that we've thought about maybe doing something for, particularly for our campus.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. This was very interesting. I have related question, but not directly touch your work, but I would love to know your opinion, because nowadays there's kind of big discussion in some communities in social computing, researchers working with like doing this gender identification task that is basically given a name, assign a gender, and these are people that work. Like in Wikipedia, it's not a big thing because you can go to the Wikidata information directly, but to other platforms where you usually have just a name or an account name, people use this a lot because it allows to basically enrich your data and try to get statistics doing breakdown. But there's been some controversy because a lot of people also say that it's incorrect to assume gender from names. So with the recommendations that you mentioned before, and in general, I would like to know what you think about this discussion. You think it's something that the researchers shouldn't do at all, or should be done with some kind of?
Yeah, that's actually a really fascinating question, because I saw a really great presentation at the American Library Association conference about this very issue. And it was particularly around using artificial intelligence to assign gender to Wikipedia articles for people of color. And it was almost ubiquitously misgendering African-American women. It was assigning them male just based on the photos alone. And so that researcher was talking about the dangers of having artificial intelligence do these kind of image scanning and automated population of metadata that assume gender based on images. So I think there are some very real concerns. I get why people want to do it. I mean, we're always trying to use technology for good, to scale up, to kind of get these bigger scale problems, but there are so many bias issues inherent in artificial intelligence, not only for gendering images, but other things where we're trying to have AI do metadata creation for us. Does that answer your question? Yeah, and it's particularly, if an artificial intelligence machine is doing it, the chances of it having references, or it's probably just making, very algorithmic programmatical decisions. It's not really verifying it using secondary sources or, that kind of information. If I can find the name of that presentation, I'll share it. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was specifically talking about the use of artificial intelligence in libraries and the sort of dangers of doing so.
Thank you.
There's actually a YouTube video on it too. Sorry.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Diego, for bringing, because I have had this discussion with Diego also recently. And I was remembering, like, it was in summer 2020 that there was that machine learning model through an API called Genderify, and there were like several concerns. I remember academics like Sasa Constanza shock. So we like the ethical problems while doing research, like doing gender inference, while gender attributes, according to certain scholars, should be self-declared or at least ask. So I have another question. I'm curious by the response you shared about that open question, like not going more complex than man, woman, non-binary, because that seems like a hot mess. So I was wondering if you're aware of any other spaces apart from gender that create this level of hitness in Wikidata. And this is also a question for Diego, since like there are several approaches to measure controversy in Wikipedia, and Diego has been working recently in measuring controversy also in Wikidata. So I don't know if you are familiar with similar controversies, and if not, what would be the best strategies to identify those spaces that should be relevant to be aware of?
Yeah, I am not sure. I am not sure about the sort of, we didn't really focus too much around other demographic properties. We got that people are including them, but in our responses, we didn't really get people responding with the same sort of, hey, I feel really uncomfortable with the choices I have available here to enter for race or sexual, even sexual orientation, which was surprising. And the question that we asked was, are you using controlled vocabularies for the information you included, which that was broad. It was for both race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, but it was just the gender question that came up in our data. But I'm sure that there's got to be some other issues. related to other demographic properties. I think there was an article in Cataloging and Classification Quarterly that was talking about how they went about identifying African American scholarship and how they went about defining like African American and making sure that they weren't like categorizing. And I think they did some work to try to, I'm probably going to do a terrible job of summing up this article, but they're basically trying to be extra sure that they were, you know, including people who didn't identify as African American, if that makes sense. They really wanted to be very clear and more precise about who was included in that list to make sure that it was accurate. So there has been some other research around different demographic properties. Thank you, Laurie. You post the article in. I'm terrible at remembering names of things. Yes. Oh wait, no, this is a different. Is that the right article? I'm lost. Yes, that's the article I'm talking about. So, so yeah, there are other discussions about demographic properties, and it comes up a lot.
Just to give context to the people who are watching this session, like Laurie has shared in the chat link, and we will share it also on YouTube for viewers to be aware of this article.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think that, you know, some of these other properties could get complex because, you know, maybe, especially with artificial intelligence, can you imagine it trying to guess race or ethnicity? I mean, there's so much variation of things that could go wrong in that approach. So, yeah.
Okay, I don't know if there are more questions. If not, I have like one final question. I also like your recommendation on coordination work between academic librarians and open knowledge platforms practitioners outside of the GLAM sphere. So I was wondering, what about researchers? How can we coordinate collaboration between librarians and researchers working on Wikimedia projects? And this is a general question for all the speakers. And not an easy one, yeah.
Yeah, it's not an easy one. I was going to let maybe Laurie or Michael take that one. It sounded like their project was more about sort of coordinating a broader community of researchers and getting them to contribute to this open access book.
This is a difficult question because, for example, I do qualitative research myself. But I don't do statistical research. I have taken some stats classes, but it's not my area of expertise. And for many American librarians that need to publish as part of our jobs, it's not part of our expertise. So, but there are things like I was just talking in the background with Michael that with the Wikipedia article that I've been monitoring and editing, which is Genderqueer, a Memoir, which is currently the most banned book in the United States. In editing that, I had to seek out I had to seek out a block from anonymous editing because people kept changing the pronouns. And so, I mean, a study that I assume would not be that difficult, but I don't know how to do it, would be to just, take, a certain number of articles that are viewed frequently about transgendered persons and see how often the pronouns are changed back and forth. And the only reason it was blocked from anonymous editing was simply because I knew enough to ask someone to block it. But other people don't know that are newer to editing. They don't know that that there's the potential for that. So I think even things like that would be interesting and useful.
Yeah, I kind of springboarding off of what Laurie said. This was my very first experience with any type of peer-reviewed research article. So I was stepping into definite new territory, and even identifying who to work with on that article was kind of, that question of like, I'm certain other people are already working in these spaces and working on these questions, and identifying ways to sort of partner up and work together was kind of a new question for me. So yeah, I'm not really sure. Maybe I know the Wikimedia community is really great at having coordination around Wikipedia, Sinopia. Like there's a bunch of people who are starting to work together on different spaces. So maybe there needs to be like a coordinated sort of research. What do you call it? Not showing off the research you already did, but sort of brainstorming research ideas that people can work together on.
I have some ideas. And this kind of moves beyond like the actual research point itself, but I think researchers tend to have a more privileged relationship with media than librarians do. And it's not all researchers, but I think like one of the biggest challenges is the availability. We can study gaps as much as we want, but what are some solutions that we can offer to fixing those gaps? And I think one of the first people that we need to really get the ear of is that of the media, because the media is news articles are huge in Wikipedia. And if the media isn't talking about gender minority communities, then we'll never be able to give them visibility in Wikipedia unless we're able to change rules, which I feel like getting the media to jump on board of Wikipedia will be much easier than getting like notability rules changed and what constitutes a notable source. But so that's like the first thing. And I think the other thing is, and I don't know if this is the case in other countries right now, but in Canada, for the government agencies that do sponsored research that people can get research grants for, one of the things that our grants are requiring now is there's a section in the grant application about how are they going to contribute to knowledge transfer. And I think just getting more and more researchers to think about how can I take my research out of this very high level, often like very inaccessible for somebody who's not within the domain themselves. How can I bring it down to a level that is easier for people to understand? And I think Wikipedia is like a really great platform for that. And I'm speaking to the choir because I think we all believe that Wikipedia is a good platform to contribute to like taking research and making it more acceptable to people. But I think it's I think librarians and researchers naturally we can work really well together, and using Wikipedia as a platform and it can be very narcissistic and just like getting people's research out and making it more accessible for people, and like but also like we all have these interesting networks, and it's like bringing people outside of the academy, outside of the university into our networks, particularly. And like the thing I think about a lot is like bringing journalists in. But I think those are like two ways that we can support each other and maybe also contribute to a better visibility of underrepresented communities. Because if we have the ear of our journalists, then we can talk more about the questions that Nerissa brought up in her presentation about, just because we know a piece of information about somebody, should we actually write it down? Anyhow, yeah.
Okay, thank you for your answers. I guess oh, Laurie?
No.
Okay.
No, I'm fine.
Okay. I just saw you on mute. Okay, so if there are no more questions or more answers to the questions already posed, I would like to thank everyone for joining the Wikimedia Research Showcase today and this lively discussion. I especially want to thank our speakers, Laurie, Michael, and Nerissa, for their contributions. The Wikimedia Research Showcase is made possible thanks to a coordination team with my colleagues Diego and Emily Leskak. Thank you both for all the work that you're doing. Thank you to my colleague Miriam, who also helped with the Q&A today. And also thanks to Emerald for the support with the audio and video. Before closing the showcase, I would like to recall that the second edition of the Wikimedia Research Fund was launched some weeks ago, and we are accepting proposals until December 16. And actually today it has been released, the form, through the EasyChair platform. So please check the details on Meta and feel welcome to attend our office hours if feedback is needed. The next showcase in December 2022 will cover insights from the Wikimedia Foundation research team. So we are looking forward to seeing you all there. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.